The screaming began 3 cycles before the Council of Seers dissolved into madness. Not the screaming of battle or the wail of dying souls, but something worse, something older, something that crawled up from the infinity circuits themselves and clawed at the minds of every living Eldar aboard Craftworld Ulthwé. It was the sound of a species remembering what it had forgotten, the primal howl of a civilization that had once ruled the stars with absolute dominion and absolute depravity. The path had been abandoned, cast aside like chains by those who claimed they remembered freedom. They did not remember what freedom had cost them. They were about to learn again. Farseer Eldanesh stood in the dome of crystal seers and felt the wraithbone beneath his feet pulse with something that was not life, but not quite death either. Around him, the other Farseers swayed in their ritual positions, their minds touching and recoiling like wounded animals. Something fundamental had broken. The psychic network that bound them, that had held for 10,000 years, was coming apart. He could taste it in the air, bitter and electric, like ozone before a storm that would never end. The argument had not been new. For 10 millennia, since She Who Thirsts had been born screaming into reality and devoured 99% of the Eldar race in a single instant, the survivors had debated their response. The path had been adopted as law, as the only barrier between existence and extinction. Every Eldar would walk a single discipline at a time, focusing their entire being on one aspect of their infinite potential. An artisan would create and only create, a warrior would fight and only fight. It was restriction. It was survival. It had worked for 100 centuries. Then came Maerandil. The Autarch had stood in the Hall of Convocations, his armor still scored from battle, and spoken words that would reshape everything. "Path does not protect us," he said, his voice carrying to every ear and every mind. "It diminishes us. We are shadows of what we were, pale ghosts pretending at life while we cage ourselves in ritual and fear. Our ancestors were gods who shaped reality with thought alone. We have become mice who scurry through a dead garden and call our terror wisdom." The Farseers had tried to silence him. Eldanesh himself had woven strands of probability and possibility, showing the Autarch visions of what awaited any Eldar who abandoned the path's protection. He had shown him the hunger of She Who Thirsts, the youngest god, Slaanesh, the devourer of souls. Every Eldar soul was a beacon to that terrible entity, and only the strictest mental discipline could shield them from eternal hunger. "The path is not tradition," Eldanesh had warned. "It is the dam that holds back an ocean of damnation." Maerandil had laughed. Not the musical laugh of Eldar joy, but something harsh and bitter that tasted of ashes. "You show me fear and call it wisdom. You show me chains and call them shelter. I have walked the path of the warrior for 3 centuries. I have killed in the name of Kane and felt the war god's fury burn through my veins. And when I remove my mask, when I return to the supposed peace of the craft world, I feel nothing but emptiness. We are not living. We are slowly dying while pretending our careful deaths are choices." The words spread like poison through water. In the artisan domes, sculptors paused mid-strike. In the aspect shrines, warriors stood frozen in their training forms. In the infinity circuits, the dead themselves stirred uneasily. The Eldar had once been a race without limits. They had created gods through the power of their collective unconscious. They had reshaped reality to suit their pleasures. They had burned so bright that they had torn a hole in the universe itself. The path had been meant to prevent that from ever happening again. But Maerandil asked, a question that could not be unasked. What was the point of survival, if survival meant the death of everything that made them who they were? The debate raged for weeks. Some defended the path with religious fervor, pointing to the spirit stones they all wore, the soul gems that would capture their essence at death and preserve them from She Who Thirsts. Without the path's discipline, they argued, every Eldar would become a beacon drawing the great enemy's gaze. Others, particularly the younger Eldar, listened to Maerandil with growing hunger. They wanted to feel the full spectrum of existence without carefully measured doses. Eldanesh watched the fractures spreading through his people and looked into the skein of possible futures. What he saw there turned his blood to ice. Every thread, every probability showed the same pattern. If the Eldar abandoned the path, they would fall, not immediately, but inevitably. Their souls would blaze brighter without careful controls, and that brightness would draw attention they could not survive. She who thirsts would feed, the Craftworld would die. He presented this to the Council. They called for Maerandil's exile. The Autarch refused. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He called for a vote, not among the Council, but among all the Eldar of Ulthwé. Every artisan, every warrior, every civilian would decide. He invoked ancient rites that predated the path itself, democratic traditions from before the fall. The vote was chaos, but the civilian population responded with shocking unity. They wanted to be free. The vote passed by a narrow margin. The path was no longer mandatory on Craftworld Ulthwé. The screaming began shortly after. Not all at once, but gradually, like the first drops of rain before a storm. An artisan in the Western Spires threw herself from a balcony after staring at her own sculpture for 16 hours without pause, her mind unable to process the sudden lack of boundaries. A group of former aspect warriors got into a brawl in the communal gardens, their discipline eroding. 2 warlocks attempted a psychic duel, and both suffered catastrophic mental collapse, leaving them as drooling husks in permanent feedback loops. Eldanesh tried to intervene. He gathered those Farseers who still believed and attempted to create a stabilizing psychic network. It failed within hours. The sheer chaos of millions of Eldar souls suddenly unleashed was like trying to calm an ocean with a teaspoon. The psychic pressure built and built until reality itself began to fray at the edges. Wraithbone walls started bleeding colors that had no names. Corridors began leading to places that existed only in nightmares. Then the aspect shrines failed. The temples dedicated to Kane's war aspects had been built to contain and channel violence. When warriors attempted to maintain battle fury while pursuing artistic endeavors, the shrines shattered under the strain. Now they stood empty and dark, their walls cracked and weeping a substance that left stains like screaming faces. The warriors themselves scattered. Some sealed themselves in their armor permanently, unable to remove the war masks without losing their minds. They stalked Ulthwé's corridors like hunting beasts, attacking anyone they encountered with mindless fury. Others tried to reject their warrior nature entirely, casting aside their weapons overnight. Most suffered complete mental breakdowns. Eldanesh witnessed one of the most disturbing transformations personally. An exarch named Maerandil, bonded to his armor for over 2,000 years, attempted to remove his helm. When it came off, his face was smooth and ageless, but his eyes were empty. Not vacant, but literally empty. 2 dark holes leading down into infinite depths. He was a puppet of war, and without the armor to give him purpose, he was nothing at all. He stood there for several minutes, his empty eyes weeping tears of liquid light. Then he began to scream, not pain or fear, but pure, absolute nothingness, the sound of a soul realizing it no longer existed. The armor tried to pull him back in. The helmet lifted from his hands and attempted to reattach itself. Maerandil fought back, clawing at his own face, trying to feel something that would prove he was more than just a weapon. The struggle lasted less than a minute. The armor won. The helmet resealed itself. The exarch stopped screaming, and the empty vessel resumed its eternal vigil. There was no victory there. Only the continued existence of a war machine wearing the skin of something that had once been Eldar. The artisan domes collapsed differently but no less completely. Without the path to structure their creative impulses, artists attempted to express everything simultaneously. A sculptor would begin capturing grief, then shift mid-strike to joy, then rage, then peace, all within seconds. The resulting creations were abominations, wraithbone twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. Some artisans forgot to eat or sleep, their bodies withering while their minds burned with creative fire. Others descended into catatonia, overwhelmed by infinite possibilities and unable to choose a single direction. The infinity circuits themselves began to fail. These vast psychic networks contained the souls of every Eldar who had died on Ulthwé over 10,000 years, preserving their consciousness in wraithbone matrices where she who thirsts could not reach. But the circuits relied on stability, on careful balance between the living and the dead. When the living abandoned discipline, when their souls began burning brighter and more chaotically, the circuits started to overload. The dead were stirring. Consciousness dormant for centuries woke, confused and frightened. Some tried to reach out to the living, to warn them or beg for order's restoration. Others, driven mad by sudden emotional influx, attempted to break free entirely, to manifest as wraith, constructs, or possess the living. The wraithbone itself was dying. The psychoreactive material that formed every craftworld required stability, focused intention, controlled emotion. The chaos spreading through Ulthwé was poisoning it at a fundamental level. Walls developed cancerous growths. Corridors shifted without reason. Entire sections became hostile to Eldar life. Chambers sealed themselves and filled with psychic poison. Gardens where plants developed a taste for Eldar flesh. Meditation halls where wraithbone grew inward like grasping fingers, trapping those inside in permanent embrace. The civilian population fractured along lines that made no sense. Traditional bonds dissolved as individuals pursued freedom without regard for others. Former lovers became bitter enemies. Children were abandoned by parents too consumed by liberation to remember responsibilities. The elderly, who had walked the path for millennia, were attacked and sometimes killed by younger Eldar who saw them as symbols of old repression. Violence spread, not ritualized shrine violence, but raw, unfiltered aggression born of frustration and fear and too much freedom too quickly. Eldanesh tried to establish safe zones where believers in the path could gather. These enclaves were under constant assault from individuals who saw any structure as threat. Then the spirit stones began to fail. Every Eldar wore one. Soul gems psychically bonded to their essence, ready to capture consciousness at death. It was the only insurance against Slaanesh's hunger. But the stones required proper attunement, required the careful discipline the path provided. Without that discipline, the bonds weakened. Eldanesh watched as spirit stones across the craft world began to crack and shatter. Each broken gem was a soul lost forever, consumed instantly by the hungering god waiting in the warp. The deaths began slowly, then accelerated. An Eldar in the commercial districts clutched at his throat as his spirit. Stone shattered. His scream cut short as his soul was ripped from his body and dragged into the warp. A group of guardians collapsed simultaneously. In the artisan domes, entire workshops went silent. The dead did not fall peacefully. They convulsed and writhed, faces frozen in absolute horror. Panic spread like wildfire. The population began desperate flight toward the webway portals. But the webway required psychic coordination to navigate, required unified will to open and maintain gates. The chaos prevented coordination. Gates opened randomly, leading to wrong destinations or nowhere at all. Some plunged through portals and simply disappeared. Others found themselves in the void of space or deep within war zones. Maerandil appeared in the dome of Crystal Seers like a ghost. The Autarch who had started this catastrophe looked haggard, his eyes haunted. "I was wrong," he said simply. The words hung in the air, inadequate and devastating. Eldanesh wanted to rage at him, to unleash fury. But what would be the point? Maerandil already understood. Every scream was a reminder. Every shattered spirit stone was condemnation. He had thought the path was a prison. He learned too late that prisons sometimes protect their inmates from worse things outside. The wraithbone beneath their feet suddenly buckled and heaved. The dome of Crystal Seers began to collapse inward. Spikes erupted from the floor, reaching toward the Farseers like accusing fingers. The crystal panels that had once shown visions of possible futures now displayed only scenes of horror, endless variations of the same outcome repeating in fractal patterns. Eldanesh made his decision. He could not save the craft world. He could not save his people. But he could deny she who thirsts one final victory. He could ensure that some record survived, some warning to other craft worlds that might be tempted down the same path. He reached out to the infinity circuits and began to encode everything he had witnessed. Every death, every transformation, every moment of the unraveling would be preserved where any Farseer with skill could access it. The dead resisted him, panicking, sensing approaching doom. Eldanesh forced through their resistance, burning his own life force to power the encoding. He could feel his spirit stone growing hot against his chest, sense the psychic bonds holding his soul beginning to fray. He was dying, but he would complete this final duty. The craft world shuddered one final time. The barriers between reality and the warp collapsed completely. She who thirsts manifested directly into the materium, her presence so overwhelming that Wraithbone crumbled to ash, and Eldar souls ignited like candles. Eldanesh felt her hunger wash over him, felt the Dark Prince's attention focus on his burning soul with predator intensity. His spirit stone cracked. The last thing Farseer Eldanesh felt before oblivion claimed him was a whisper in his mind, a voice that was both his own and something far more terrible. We were gods once. We reached for divinity and created only damnation. The path was not our punishment, it was our mercy, and we refused it. Silence. Silence fell over Craftworld Ulthwé. Where millions had lived and died and lived again through infinity circuits, there was now only emptiness. The Wraithbone structure remained, a ghost ship drifting through the void, but no life stirred within its corridors. Spirit stones lay scattered like broken glass, their captive souls devoured. The aspect shrines stood empty and dark. The artisan domes held only twisted remnants of final works that would never be completed. Other craft worlds found Ulthwé 2 cycles later. The rescue fleet approached with extreme caution, their seers reaching out psychically to determine what had occurred. What they found in the infinity circuits made them weep. The warning Eldanesh had encoded was clear and terrible. The path was not optional. It was not tradition to be, discarded when convenient. It was the single thread separating the Eldar from the abyss that had swallowed their civilization once before. To abandon it was to invite extinction. The story of Ulthwé spread through the surviving craft worlds like a plague of wisdom. Some refused to believe it, but the Farseers who examined the circuits knew the truth. They had witnessed every step of the unraveling through stored memory, had felt Eldanesh's final desperate encoding burning into the psychic matrix. There was no external enemy. Ulthwé had destroyed itself through the simple act of choosing freedom over structure. On Craftworld Ulthwé, the Council renewed their vows to the path, with religious fervor. On Bieltan, the aspect warriors sealed themselves in their shrines and refused to emerge except for war. On Saimhan, the wild riders who had always chafed under the path's restrictions fell silent and contemplative. Everywhere the story reached, the response was the same. The path would be maintained. The discipline would be enforced, because the alternative was not freedom but annihilation. Yet even as the craft worlds recommitted to salvation through restriction, whispers remained. In shadows of artisan domes and private chambers of rebellious youth, voices circulated. Maerandil had been right, they said, but he had moved too quickly. The path was still a cage. Eventually, they would need to evolve beyond the prison or die as a species regardless. But that was a question for another time. Years passed. The memory of Ulthwé became legend, then cautionary tale, then liturgy. Young Eldar learned of it as warning. Do not stray from the path. Do not question the wisdom of your elders. Freedom is another word for death. Then Farseer Laetharian of Craftworld Ulthwé proposed an expedition. She was young for a Farseer, only 6 centuries old, but she possessed a peculiar gift for psychic archaeology, the ability to sift through layers of memory to find original motivations buried beneath millennia of tradition. She wanted to examine Ulthwé's infinity circuits directly, to understand not just what happened, but why. The Council approved with reluctance, assigning her warlocks and rangers for protection. The journey through the webway was tense. The psychic atmosphere around portals leading to Ulthwé was thick with residual horror, the imprint of millions of souls screaming into eternal torment. The webway gate hung open like a wound, its psychic seals broken from inside. They emerged into a corridor that had once been beautiful. Now the wraithbone walls were covered in growths resembling tumors or screaming faces. The air was wrong, too thick and too thin simultaneously. The lighting came from the wraithbone itself, sickly phosphorescence that made shadows dance in defiance of physics. They passed through what had been a residential district. Laetharian looked into one dwelling and immediately wished she had not. The inhabitants had died attempting some form of psychic communion, their spirit stones shattered violently. But worse than the bodies was the art covering every surface. Someone had painted the walls with images that hurt to perceive, mathematical impossibilities rendered in pigment that seemed to shift between colors with no names. They found the first intact infinity circuit in the Hall of Remembrance. It manifested as a web of light suspended in air, threads of pure psychic energy connecting nodes of crystallized memory. Normally, such circuits glowed with soft, welcoming radiance. This one pulsed with angry red glow, its structure warped. Laetharian approached with extreme caution, extending her senses gradually. She could feel the stored consciousness inside, thousands of souls trapped in a matrix no longer functioning properly. Some were screaming, minds locked in eternal loops of final moments. Others had fragmented, personalities splintering into component parts no longer coherent. A few remained stable, surrounded by psychic static that made communication nearly impossible. She reached out to one stable consciousness, a scholar named Theriast who had died 2 centuries before Ulthwé's fall. Making contact felt like plunging her hand into freezing water mixed with broken glass. But she maintained connection through discipline and determination. What Theriast showed her changed everything. The scholar had been one of those advocating for change before the fall. Not abandonment, but evolution. Theriast had studied historical records from before the original fall and reached a disturbing conclusion. The path as it existed was not true salvation. It was a temporary measure, a bandage on a wound requiring surgery. The real problem was not that Eldar experienced too much emotion, but that they had never learned to integrate their experiences, never developed psychological structures to contain intensity without being consumed. The scholar's proposal had been radical. Instead of walking single paths sequentially, Eldar should develop a meta-path, a discipline of disciplines teaching integration rather than suppression. An Eldar should learn to be warrior and artist simultaneously, holding multiple aspects in balance through conscious effort rather than artificial restriction. More difficult than the current system, requiring more individual strength, but also more sustainable. Theriast had presented this to the Council years before Maerandil's rebellion. It was rejected, not because the logic was flawed, but because the risk was too great. Even if correct, the transition period would be catastrophic. Better to maintain the known imperfect system than gamble on unknown potential improvement. But Maerandil had apparently encountered Theriast's work. The Autarch had taken the careful analysis and stripped away all caution, all acknowledgement of risk. He had seen only the core argument that the path was inadequate and concluded immediate abandonment was necessary. Theriast, watching from the infinity circuits, had tried to warn that this was not what the research indicated. No one listened. The lure of immediate liberation was too strong. Laetharian withdrew from contact, her mind reeling. If the scholar was correct, the path was indeed inadequate, but the solution was not abandonment. The solution was evolution, transformation into something more sophisticated and demanding. But such evolution required resources and stability the Eldar no longer possessed. They were a dying race, scattered, constantly beset by enemies. They did not have the luxury of experimental psychology or gradual transformation. They needed immediate, reliable survival mechanisms. The team pressed deeper into Ulthwé. The path took them through the aspect shrines. What Laetharian saw there would haunt her forever. In the Shrine of the Dire Avengers, she found armor of dozens of warriors scattered like discarded shells. Among the armor lay bodies, warriors, consumed by their own violence. Some had turned on each other, others had turned on themselves, armor torn open from inside as if wearers tried to claw out of their own skins. In the Shrine of the Howling Banshees, silence was absolute and terrifying. This shrine should have echoed with psychic imprint of thousands of war cries. Instead, there was nothing, a void so complete it seemed to absorb sound. The Banshees had destroyed their own shrine. In final moments, they had unleashed a psychic scream so powerful it annihilated the very concept of sound within these walls. The shrine of the striking scorpions was worst. Dark and claustrophobic by design, it was now a labyrinth of impossible geometry, corridors folding back on themselves, chambers somehow both tiny and infinite. Laetharian's team refused to enter. She could see figures moving in darkness beyond the entrance, shadows that might have been warriors still stalking prey that no longer existed, trapped forever in the hunt. They reached the central dome housing the primary infinity circuit. The wraithbone ceiling had cracked open like an eggshell, exposing interior to void. Only a psychic barrier maintained atmosphere, and that barrier was failing, flickering like a candle in wind. Through the breach, Laetharian could see stars, but they were wrong stars. She realized they were looking into the warp itself, and what she had mistaken for stars were actually eyes of daemons watching from the other side of reality, waiting for the barrier to fail so they could pour through. The infinity circuit in the central dome was massive, a structure of crystallized light large enough to fill a cathedral. It pulsed arrhythmically, glow shifting through spectrums including colors living eyes were not meant to perceive. Laetharian could feel stored souls within, millions of them, accumulated dead of Ulthwé going back 10,000 years. They were all screaming. She stepped forward, ignoring warnings, and placed both hands directly on the circuit's surface. Contact was like grabbing lightning. Power surged through her, consciousness not her own, flooding her mind, memories and emotions of millions crashing together in cacophonous disharmony. She screamed without meaning to, voice joining the chorus of the dead, but she did not let go. The gestalt entity of dead Ulthwé spoke to her in pure experience. It showed her the path from angles no living Eldar had considered. It showed her how restriction worked on fundamental psychic level, how careful narrowing created psychic camouflage, making Eldar souls less visible to she who thirsts, not less appetizing. Harder to detect, psychic signature reduced and focused into tightly controlled frequencies, not broadcasting loudly into the warp. But the entity also showed her the cost. Every moment walking the path was a moment becoming less than what an Eldar could be. The species was dying not through dramatic extinction but through slow diminishment, each generation slightly less vital, slightly less capable of greatness their ancestors achieved. In another 10,000 years on the current path, Eldar would be so reduced they would barely qualify as the same species. They would be shadows of shadows, ghosts pretending at life. The entity showed her alternatives. Some were incremental improvements, small modifications buying another few millennia without addressing underlying decay. Others were radical restructurings, offering potential salvation at enormous risk. One particularly intriguing option involved phase transformation, where young Eldar would be trained in integration techniques before beginning the path, giving them internal structures strong enough to eventually support multiple disciplines simultaneously. But every alternative required resources the Eldar did not have. Time and stability, peace and security, luxury of experimentation without immediate existential threat. The Eldar possessed none of these things. They were hunted by she who thirsts, pressed by younger races, caught between forces seeing them as prey or obstacles. They had no margin for error. The Gestalt entity's final message was a question. Was survival at the cost of slow extinction truly survival at all? If the path guaranteed, Eldar would continue existing but only as diminished shadows, was that victory or merely different defeat? And if the path was ultimately insufficient, delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it, what was the point of suffering and restriction it demanded? Laetharian had no answer. She withdrew from the circuit, her mind burning with overload, spirit stone so hot it left a mark on her skin through armor. The warlocks caught her as she collapsed. Through blurred vision, she saw the psychic barrier overhead flicker and nearly fail. Saw hungry eyes beyond press closer. They needed to leave. The journey back was nightmare of collapsing corridors and reality becoming increasingly unstable. They reached the webway portal just as the central dome's barrier finally failed. Behind them, the sound of breach was like reality itself screaming. Laetharian risked one final glance and saw daemons pouring through, lesser entities of Slaanesh drawn by concentrated misery and death, not coming to attack the living, coming to desecrate the dead, to corrupt infinity circuits and torture stored souls for eternity. The portal sealed after they passed through. A craftworld that had stood 10,000 years was now gone, not just dead but contaminated, forever closed off from the webway network. When Laetharian returned to Craftworld Ulthwé and presented findings to the Council of Seers, the response was silence. The councillors examined psychic recordings she extracted and discussed the matter for 3 full cycles. Finally, they reached verdict. The information would be classified, restricted to highest Farseer clearance. The general population would not be told about Theriast's research or alternatives to the current path. The risk of another Ulthwé was too great, Laetharian protested. She argued the Eldar had a right to know truth, to choose their own fate even if dangerous. The council rejected her arguments. The masses could not be trusted with such knowledge. If word spread the path was potentially inadequate, panic would ensue. Some would cling more tightly, becoming rigid and brittle. Others would abandon it recklessly, creating more Ulthwés. The only safe course was maintaining status quo and searching quietly for solutions without destabilizing society. She was forbidden from speaking publicly. Her team was placed under similar restrictions. The research from Ulthwé's circuits was locked in secure archives, accessible only to those who already knew enough to understand why it must remain hidden. Laetharian obeyed these restrictions for 3 years. She returned to duties as Farseer, reading skeins of fate and guiding her craft world. She trained initiates, performed rituals, maintained appearances. But inside, she was changing. The knowledge ate at her like acid, awareness that her entire civilization was trapped in slow death spiral with no apparent exit. She began to have dreams, visions that might have been prophecy or wish fulfillment. In these dreams, she saw an Eldar who had learned integration techniques, who walked all paths simultaneously without losing themselves, who stood before she who thirsts and was not consumed because their soul was too complete, too whole, too fully themselves to be reduced to sensation and devoured. She began experimenting in secret. Small things at first. She would paint while maintaining combat meditation, trying to integrate flowing creativity with focused lethality. Results were mixed. Sometimes she achieved moments of synthesis, brief instants where both disciplines enhanced each other, and she felt more alive than the path ever allowed. Other times, attempt created confusion. Neither discipline executed properly. She was not alone. Across craft worlds, small groups had begun similar attempts. Some had heard whispers despite classified status. Others reached similar conclusions independently. They called themselves the unrestricted, the integrated, the whole. They all shared the same goal. They sought to become Eldar in full rather than Eldar in part, to reclaim some measure of former glory without triggering the excess that created Slaanesh. These experimenters developed networks, secret communications through webway, and coded messages hidden in public art. They shared techniques, compared results, built knowledge about what worked and what failed catastrophically. Slowly, painfully, at cost of many souls lost when experiments went wrong, they began developing functional alternative to the path. Not replacement, an addition, a meta layer that could be built on existing structure for those strong enough to support it. But strength was the key variable. Some Eldar seemed naturally capable of integration. Others, seemingly no different, attempted same techniques and simply shattered. The experimenters searched desperately for ways to identify who could safely attempt integration. Without such identification, technique would remain too risky for general adoption. Laetharian found partial answer studying records of the Harlequins, those Eldar serving the laughing god who existed outside the path's structure. Harlequins walked all roles, playing any part in eternal performance of Eldar history and mythology. They were warriors and artists, tricksters and mystics, changing nature as easily as changing masks. And crucially, they survived this multiplicity. She who thirsts did not claim them despite lack of path discipline. The secret was narrative. Harlequins did not simply experience multiple aspects simultaneously. They wove those aspects into coherent stories, creating personal mythologies, giving structure and meaning to multiplicity. A. Harlequin was not warrior and artist. They were warrior-artist, someone for whom combat was art, and art was combat, aspects unified through narrative framework, rather than kept separate through suppression. The story was the structure, the mythology was the container. She presented this discovery to fellow experimenters. The response was electric. This was the missing piece, the method allowing integration without catastrophic risk. An Eldar needed to create personal mythology, narrative framework, explaining and unifying various aspects into coherent whole. That mythology would serve the same protective function as path restrictions but allow much greater complexity and flexibility. Not easy. Creating such mythology required profound self-knowledge and creative imagination. But it was possible, and that possibility offered hope where there had been only despair. The experimenters began teaching each other narrative techniques. They studied mythology and storytelling, learning to identify deep patterns resonating with psychic reality. They practiced creating personal narratives containing contradiction and multiplicity without collapsing into chaos. And slowly, carefully, some began to succeed. These successful integrators became proof of concept, living demonstrations the path was not the only way forward, but success brought new dangers. Integrated Eldar were powerful in ways pathwalkers were not, able to bring multiple disciplines to bear and innovate solutions specialized minds could not conceive. This power attracted attention, both from conservative councils seeing them as threats, and from she who thirsts herself, who found brighter souls more appetizing. Several integrated Eldar simply vanished, spirit stones found cracked and empty. Others were arrested and subjected to psychic reconditioning, forcing them back onto the path. A crisis point approached. The integrated Eldar could not remain hidden forever. When their existence became generally unknown, Craftworlds would have to choose. Embrace this new possibility, accepting risks for potential salvation, or reject it, doubling down on the path despite inadequacies, choosing slow, certain death over quick, uncertain gamble. The question Ulthwé had failed to answer correctly would be posed again. This time the entire surviving Eldar race would have to confront it. Laetharian stood in the dome of Seers on Ibrasil and looked into the future. The skeins of possibility spread before her, more tangled and uncertain than ever. She could see outcomes where integrated approach succeeded, where Eldar gradually transformed into something new and powerful enough to survive she who thirsts without the path's crutch. She could see outcomes where attempt failed, and every Craftworld followed Ulthwé into oblivion. And she could see outcomes where nothing changed, where the path was maintained generation after generation until Eldar simply faded away, numbers dwindling, vitality diminishing, extinct, not through dramatic catastrophe but through simple entropy. No thread showed easy victory. No possibility promised salvation without cost. She made her decision. She would speak. She would break her vow of silence and reveal what she learned in Ulthwé's ruins. Reveal Theriast's research and integration techniques the experimenters developed. The council would try to silence her. She would be declared heretic, exile, traitor. Her name would be stricken from infinity circuits, her soul denied preservation that was every Eldar's birthright. She accepted these costs. Because the alternative, watching her species slowly die while remaining silent about potential alternatives, was unbearable. She called a gathering, invoking ancient rites predating the path itself, the same rites Maerandil had used. Every Eldar on Ibrasil would hear her speak. Then they would choose, not through council decree but through individual decision, whether to continue walking the path as it existed or attempt something different. It was a risk. It might destroy her Craftworld as it destroyed Ulthwé, but doing nothing was also a risk. The slow, certain risk of extinction through diminishment. The council moved to stop her. Warlocks were dispatched to arrest her before she could speak, but Laetharian had prepared. The other experimenters, the secret network of integrated Eldar scattered across Ibrasil, revealed themselves simultaneously. They formed protective circle around her, combined psychic might enough to hold off council forces long enough for her to say what needed saying. The Eldar stood at a crossroads again, just as they had 10,000 years ago before the fall, just as they had on Ulthwé before its doom. The choice remained the same beneath all surface variations. Would they accept limitation and survive as shadows? Or would they reach for wholeness and risk everything? There was no correct answer. There was only the choice itself, and the far consequences that would flow from whichever path they selected. Laetharian stepped forward to speak. Around her, the integrated Eldar held their ground against advancing warlocks. Above them, the wraithbone dome of Seers began to resonate with psychic tension, responding to the conflict, building toward explosion or transformation. She opened her mouth, and the fate of the Eldar hung suspended in that single breath between silence and revelation. "Listen to me." Laetharian's voice rang out across the dome, amplified not by technology but by pure psychic resonance that carried her words into every mind present. "I have walked through the ruins of Ulthwé. I have touched the souls of the dead. I have seen what our freedom bought us, and I have learned what our salvation costs us. And I tell you now, we are dying either way." The warlocks advancing on her position faltered, not because her words convinced them, but because the truth in them was undeniable, carried on psychic frequencies that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the soul. Every Eldar present felt it, the weight of 10,000 years of slow diminishment, the awareness that survival through restriction was still a form of death. Maerandil was not wrong. She continued, her voice steady despite the chaos building around her. He was simply too reckless. The path does diminish us. It makes us shadows of what we were, fragments of what we could be. But he learned too late that freedom without structure is annihilation. The question is not whether we need discipline. The question is what form that discipline must take. One of the Council Farseers, ancient Kelmon, who had walked the path for over 2 millennia, stepped forward. His voice was cold as the void. "You speak heresy. You endanger us all. Ulthwé fell because they listened to such words. Ulthwé fell because they abandoned structure entirely." Laetharian shot back. "They tore down the walls without moan, building anything to replace them. I do not propose abandonment. I propose evolution. There is a difference between breaking chains and learning to forge better ones." She gestured, and psychic images bloomed in the air around her, pulled from the recordings she had extracted from Ulthwé's infinity circuits. The assembled Eldar gasped as they witnessed Theriest's research, saw the careful analysis that had been stripped of context and twisted into justification for catastrophe. They saw the scholar's true proposal, the metapath that could allow integration without dissolution, wholeness without excess. "This is what was lost," Laetharian said. "This is what Maerandil never understood. We do not need less discipline. We need more sophisticated discipline. We do not need freedom from restriction. We need restriction that serves completeness rather than fragmentation." Another counselor spoke, Farseer Eldanesh, whose visions had guided Ibrasil through 3 separate, near extinctions. "Even if what you say is true, even if such techniques could work, the risk is too great. One mistake, one Eldar who fails the integration, and their bright soul draws she who thirsts attention to us all. We cannot afford experiments with our survival. We cannot afford not to experiment," Laetharian countered. "Look at the skeins of fate, Maerandil. You have the gift. Look and tell me what you see if we continue unchanged." The ancient Farseer's eyes went distant, gazing into futures layered upon futures. When he returned to himself, his face was ashen. "I see. Diminishment. Slow fading. In 5,000 years, our numbers are half what they are now. In 10,000, we are scattered remnants hiding in the webway's deepest corners. In 20,000, he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "Extinction." Laetharian finished for him, not through catastrophic fall, but through entropy. The path preserves us. Yes, it preserves us the way. Amber preserves insects, frozen and unchanging and ultimately dead. We have traded the quick death of excess for the slow death of diminishment. I say we deserve a third option. "And if that option fails," Kelmon demanded, "if your experiments trigger another fall, if she who thirsts devours us all, Then we die as ourselves, Laetharian said quietly. Not as shadows, not as fragments. As Eldar in full, reaching for the greatness that is our birthright even as we fall. Is that not better than fading away into nothing while telling ourselves it was wisdom? Silence fell across the dome. The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over all their throats. Every Eldar present felt the weight of it, the impossible choice between certain slow death and uncertain quick death, between the prison of survival and the freedom of potential annihilation. One of the integrated Eldar surrounding Laetharian spoke up, a former dire avenger named Calith, who had learned to blend warcraft with sculpture. I have walked multiple paths simultaneously for 2 years now. I have created personal mythology that unifies rather than fragments. I still wear my spirit stone. It has not cracked. She who thirsts has not claimed me. I am proof it can be done. You are proof one individual has survived 2 years. Kelmon shot back. That proves nothing about long-term viability or applicability to the population at large. Then let us find out, another integrated, Eldar said. A young seer named Evrith who had combined artistic vision with psychic prophecy. Let those who wish to attempt the integration do so under controlled conditions. Monitor us, study us. Learn from our successes and our failures, but give us the chance to try. The council conferred among themselves in rapid psychic communion, their minds touching and debating at speeds no speech could match. Finally, Mirathane spoke as their representative. The council proposes a compromise. Those who wish to attempt integration may do so, but under strict conditions. You will be monitored constantly. At first sign of instability, you will be forced back onto the path through psychic intervention if necessary. You will not be permitted to teach others until your techniques have been proven safe over at least 1 decade. And if even one of you falls to she who thirsts, the experiment ends immediately. Laetharian considered the terms. They were restrictive, paranoid, designed to fail. But they were also an opening, an acknowledgement that the status quo was insufficient. We accept, she said, on one condition. The research from Ulthwé and Theriast's work must be made available to all Farseers across all Craftworlds. Let them decide for themselves whether to attempt similar experiments. We are not one Craftworld but a species. Our salvation, if it exists, must be species-wide. The council hesitated. Mirathane's eyes went distant again, consulting the skeins of fate. When he returned, he nodded, slowly. Agreed. The information will be shared. Other Craftworlds may pursue their own research. But Ibrazil's experiment will be the template, the controlled study that either proves or disproves the viability of integration. We will be watched by all our surviving kin. Then let us begin, Laetharian said. The next decade was a time of careful, agonizing experimentation. Laetharian and the other integrated Eldar submitted themselves to constant monitoring, every thought and emotion measured and analyzed by teams of Farseers and warlocks looking for any sign of instability. They developed training protocols, teaching techniques for creating personal mythologies that could contain multiplicity. They learned to identify psychological structures that predicted integration, success, or failure. They catalogued every variable, every factor that seemed to matter. The failures were devastating. 3 Eldar attempting integration had their spirit stones crack, their souls devoured by she who thirsts before anyone could intervene. Each death sent shockwaves through the community, raising questions about whether the entire experiment should be abandoned. But each death also provided data, information about what went wrong and how to prevent it in others. The fallen became lessons written in soulfire, their sacrifice marking boundaries that survivors learned not to cross. The successes were extraordinary. Eldar who achieved stable integration reported experiences that transcended anything the path had offered. They described a sense of wholeness, of being fully themselves for the first time in their lives. They created art that warriors understood and waged war with artistic grace. They saw futures that artists could paint and crafted beauty that contained warriors' strength. They were not fragments anymore, but complete beings, individuals who embodied the full spectrum of Eldar potential without losing themselves to excess. Word spread across the Craftworlds. Some rejected the information entirely. seeing it as dangerous heresy that would lead to another Ulthwé. Craftworld Ulthwé sealed their archives against the contamination, declaring integration to be apostasy punishable by exile or death. Others, like Craftworld Autarch with their tradition of rangers and boundary walkers, embraced the research cautiously, beginning their own controlled experiments. Craftworld Simhan, whose wild riders had always existed at the path's edge, found the integration techniques resonated with their existing practices. Most Craftworlds took middle positions, neither embracing nor rejecting but watching and waiting. They studied Ibrazel's experiment with intense interest, looking for proof one way or another. The integrated Eldar became the most watched population in the galaxy, their every success and failure analyzed by thousands of Farseers searching for patterns, for truth, for some answer to the question that had haunted their species for 10 millennia. Can we survive as ourselves, or must we remain fragments forever? 5 years into the experiment, Laetharian achieved something unprecedented. She completed a full cycle through all the major paths, while maintaining integrated consciousness throughout. She was warrior and artist, seer and guardian, all aspects held in balance through the personal mythology she had crafted. Her spirit stone remained stable, stronger if anything than when she walked single paths. She stood before the Council of Ibrazel and demonstrated abilities no pathwalker could match, weaving prophecy into combat forms, creating art that was simultaneously beautiful and lethal, thinking in layers that transcended the specialist mindset the path enforced. "This is what we could be," she said simply. "This is what we were before the fall, but controlled, disciplined, integrated rather than excessive. We do not need to choose between survival as fragments or death as whole beings. We can be whole and survive, but only if we have the courage to evolve." The council was silent for a long time. Finally, Maerandil spoke. "You have proven it is possible. For you, for those with the strength and discipline you possess. But the question remains whether this can be taught broadly, whether it can become a new path for our species, or whether it will always be available only to exceptional individuals." "Everything worth achieving is difficult," Laetharian replied. "The path was difficult when it was first established. Our ancestors spent generations learning to walk it properly. We will spend generations learning to transcend it. But we have time. Not infinite time, but enough to try." Another 5 years passed. The number of successfully integrated Eldar grew slowly but steadily. Training protocols were refined. Psychological assessment techniques improved. The casualty rate, while never reaching zero, decreased to levels comparable with other dangerous pursuits like becoming an exarch or a ranger. Integration was dangerous, yes, but no more so than many choices Eldar already accepted as necessary risks. Then came the testing point that would determine everything. A young Eldar named Sarioth, barely 2 centuries old, approached Laetharian requesting integration training. Sarioth was not exceptional, not gifted with unusual psychic strength or profound self-knowledge. She was, by all measures, average. An artisan of moderate skill who had walked her path for only 50 years, still early in her development. By all traditional thinking, she should have been told to continue her current path for at least another century before considering anything as advanced as integration. But Sarioth had seen the integrated Eldar, had witnessed what they could achieve, and wanted that wholeness for herself. "I am tired of being a fragment," she said. "I paint, and I am told to only paint, to suppress everything else that I am. But I dream of fighting. I dream of seeing future. I dream of being all the things I could be. Why must I wait? Why must I deny myself?" Laetharian looked at the young Eldar and saw the entire species reflected in her eyes. If integration could work for Sarioth, if someone average and impatient could achieve it, then it could become more than experimental technique. It could become a true alternative to the path, available to any Eldar willing to do the work. "It will be difficult," Laetharian warned, "more difficult than anything you have attempted. You will need to confront aspects of yourself you have been trained to suppress. You will need to create a personal mythology strong enough to contain contradictions and multiplicities that most Eldar spend millennia learning to manage separately. And if you fail, the price is your soul. I understand, Seriath said. And I still choose to try. The training took 3 years. Seriath struggled constantly, her average abilities pushed to breaking points again and again. She nearly failed twice, her spirit stone cracking slightly before Laetharian's intervention stabilized her. She wept with frustration, raged against the difficulty, begged to give up, and returned to the comfortable simplicity of single-path walking. But she did not give up. On the day of her final assessment, Seriath stood before the Council of Yggdrasil and demonstrated integrated consciousness. She painted a scene of battle while simultaneously reading its tactical implications. She fought with grace that was pure artistry. She saw futures painted in color and sang prophecies that were also war songs. She was not exceptional. She was simply whole, all her aspects unified through the personal mythology she had painfully constructed over 3 years of constant effort. When she finished, the council sat in stunned silence. Then, slowly, Farseer Maerandil began to weep. Not tears of sorrow, but of something that might have been hope. "It can be taught," he whispered. "It can be learned. We are not condemned to remain fragments forever." The decision was made that day. Integration would be offered as an alternative to the traditional path for all Eldar of Yggdrasil. Not a replacement, but an option, a choice each individual could make for themselves. Those who preferred the safety and simplicity of single-path walking would continue as before. Those who wanted the danger and wholeness of integration would be given training and support. The Craftworld would become a laboratory, testing whether an Eldar civilization could survive and thrive with multiple approaches to psychic discipline, existing side by side. Word spread across the galaxy. Other Craftworlds watched Yggdrasil's transformation with fascination and fear. Some began their own integration programs, carefully controlled experiments modeled on Yggdrasil's protocols. Others remained committed to traditional path walking, seeing any deviation as the first step toward another Ulthwé. The Eldar species, already fragmented across scattered Craftworlds, fragmented further along philosophical lines. But something else was happening too. The integrated Eldar were not just surviving. They were thriving in ways pathwalkers could not match. They were creating art that resonated across Craftworlds, fighting with innovation that surprised enemies, seeing futures with clarity that came from multiple perspectives held simultaneously. They were, in small but measurable ways, beginning to reverse the long diminishment that had defined their species for 10,000 years. Laetharian stood in the dome of Crystal Seers 20 years after her expedition to Ulthwé and looked into the skeins of fate. The futures she saw were different now. Still uncertain, still dangerous, but no longer inevitably declining. Some threads showed catastrophic failure, Craftworlds falling as Ulthwé had fallen when integration went wrong. But other threads showed transformation. Eldar gradually becoming something new, something that could face she who thirsts without hiding behind self-imposed fragmentation. The question was no longer whether the Eldar would survive. It was what they would become in the act of surviving. "We were gods once," she said quietly to the empty dome. "We fell because we reached too high without wisdom. Now we crawl because we fear to reach at all. Perhaps there is a middle path. Perhaps we can learn to reach with wisdom, to embrace our full nature without losing ourselves to it. Or perhaps we will fail and join Ulthwé in the darkness." She paused, then smiled, the expression both sad and defiant. "But at least we will fail as ourselves. At least we will have tried." The Eldar's story was not over. It would never be over until the last of their kind finally faded into darkness or transformed into something that could survive the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. The path had saved them from extinction. Integration might save them from diminishment, or it might doom them all. There was no way to know except to walk forward and see where the journey led. In the infinity circuits of dead Ulthwé, sealed away from the webway and haunted by daemons, Eldanesh's final warning still pulsed through damaged psychic matrices. The message was clear: Freedom without structure is death. But Laetharian had learned another truth from those same circuits. Structure without growth is also death, just slower, just quieter, just as final. The Eldar would have to find their own answer, walk their own path between the twin abysses of excess and diminishment. They would stumble. They would fall. Some would be lost to she who thirsts. Others would fade into insignificance. But some, perhaps, would become what their ancestors could have been if they had possessed wisdom to match their power, complete beings, whole souls. Eldar who could stand before the darkness and not break because they were too fully themselves to fragment. It was a hope worth dying for. And in the grim darkness of the far future, hope was the rarest treasure of all. The choice had been made. Now came the consequences. And the Eldar, as always, would pay for their choices with their souls.